finished up the American Revolution, possibly along with the Civil War, certainly the two most momentous events in American history. And this tape, hopefully I can get it in one, but he's a big guy, may have to do an overflow tape on George Washington, who is the key man, the father of his country before there even was a country. Throughout the period of the war, and throughout the period of the new nation, really before 1800, he dies in December of 1799. George Washington is America, both to us and to Europeans. Now remember, Ben Franklin is the symbolic American in Europe, and also a very important man. He is throughout the war, but he's in Europe. He is our liaison with France. He gets us the money to fight the war. George Washington is the man on the ground here. You have to remember, America has no long history. You look at Britain and they can go back 3,000 years. We don't have that. Our heritage, our past is really this group of founding fathers, and why we need to spend so much time on it, on those guys. George Washington is always one of the two, number 1 and 2, along with Abraham Lincoln, the most important men in American history. Who's 1 and 2? It's toss up with those two. He is a legend in his own time. As one of his friends said, George Washington was born with his clothes on and his hair powdered. You can't imagine George Washington as a 2-year-old or in diapers. You just don't do that. When Lafayette led the French Revolution, after they cut off the head of the king, they tore down the king's prison in Paris, the Bastille, which no longer exists, although it is a subway stop. I actually went and stopped there. I was hoping there were some remains. There aren't, but it was named after that. And the key to the Bastille, in other words, the king's prison, the key to the prison, when it was overthrown and the people in Paris tore it apart stone by stone. The key to the Bastille was given to Lafayette to take to America because America was the inspiration for the French Revolution. Lafayette did not bring it to the American Congress. He brought it to George Washington. And if you want to see the key to Bastille, it is in Mount Vernon, in a little glass box above the door. So George Washington is the man of the hour for over 25 years. His entire life, almost his entire adult life, 45 years of public service. He dedicated himself to the American cause. There were certainly smarter men, but even they said George Washington is the greatest among us. So who is George Washington? He was born 1732. Father was a self-made man. He was born in comfortable middle class, but father basically rose from being very poor. Father was very strong. He was very athletic. He had a medium-sized plantation, which in Virginia, that was about 10,000 acres, and father owned 49 slaves. He had started with nothing. He had a very limited education, but he was well-read. There were books in the house. Family had been in Virginia since 1650s. With his first wife, Augustine Washington, his father, had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Those children were educated, and of course, they would inherit. Wife dies. What do you do in Virginia? You immediately find another wife, if you can find one. George Washington was the first of 6 children with the second wife. So when the father dies, George Washington is 11, but what will he inherit? Nothing. The children, the sons from the first wife, will inherit everything. George Washington went to live with his older half-brother Lawrence, who was 14 years older. He had a basic education, George Washington, a couple years of school, but he is trained as a surveyor, and he did close to 200 surveys were done in his hand. By the age of 20, since he's involved with land, he already owns 2,300 acres. He had a good eye for land, George Washington. Fortunately for George Washington, unfortunately for his brother died at age 21 of tuberculosis, no wife, no children. And in his will, George Washington got everything. So George Washington inherits 10,000 acres, 10 miles along the Potomac River, very choice property, and 50 slaves as well. So he is a pretty wealthy landowner at the age of 21. Blue-gray eyes, 6'3", brown hair, 180 pounds. This is a magnificent physical specimen. Renowned athlete, dancer, great dancer, oddly enough, one of the best riders in Virginia. As a teenager, he had a friend bet him that he couldn't throw a rock over a stone wall, a stone arch in Virginia, a famous stone arch. The arch is 215 feet tall, and George Washington threw a stone over it. So this is a guy who's very athletic, very rarely sick, which is a great thing in a general. When he finally died, they did the standard treatment at the time. They bled him. They opened a vein and took some blood out because he was running a fever. They thought, oh, you have too much blood in you, you're too red. And they bled him of 5 pints of blood in the 2 weeks before he died. Now, the human body only has something like 8 pints of blood. So basically, they helped kill the guy. But it's a testament to how strong he was that he didn't die with the first one. Anyway, also, you have some pictures there. This is still the Revolutionary file. And slide number 60 starts with George Washington. And you have different pictures throughout his life, different paintings. And of course, down there you have one of the great myths. George Washington had wooden teeth. He did not have wooden teeth. He was a very wealthy man. He had ivory teeth. Elephant ivory, we think. There's also myths about he had slave teeth. That's entirely possible. I don't think he knocked out anybody's teeth, but people lost teeth fairly regularly at that time. But he had ivory and calcium teeth, not wooden teeth. Started losing his teeth by the age of 20. By the time he's president, he didn't have a single tooth in his head that was his. So he had these artificial teeth made, and this is interesting. There was no Fixodent then. How did you keep your teeth in your head? You had to grip them down and not talk too much, because if you started laughing hysterically, your teeth would fall out of your mouth and roll down the street. So this is a real indication. George Washington was known to rarely speak and almost never laugh. It could have been his teeth. He's also a very serious fellow, but certainly the teeth had something to do with it. Anyway, so he's now a large landowner in Virginia. His first, he proposes to a local girl that he fell in love with. She turns him down, interestingly enough. At the age of 23, he marries Martha Custis, who is 4 years older than him and over a foot shorter than him. She's exactly 5 feet. He's 6'3". She was recently widowed. She has lost her husband. She has lost a brother. She has lost one of her 2 sons. She brings into the marriage a daughter and a surviving son. The daughter dies of epilepsy during the Revolution, so this is another thing he has to deal with. He couldn't even go home for her funeral. The son survives, turns out to be pretty worthless all his life, and they kept bailing him out of all kinds of trouble. He was drunk, he had illegitimate children, just pretty worthless guy. When she comes into the marriage, when he marries Martha Custis, he has control over another 18,000 acres of land, her money, and more slaves. So he legally owns a third of Martha's land, but he manages the other 2/3 for her children. So the age of 25 or so, he is probably the largest landowner in the county, and he owns close to 200 slaves. Some hashtags for George Washington. Remember, he is on Mount Rushmore. That's a good hashtag for him. His own troops called him Old Stoneface. This was long before Mount Rushmore, of course, but he is rock solid. His other nickname was Old Faithful. Like Mount Rushmore, this is a man made of stone. On the other hand, there's some hidden layers there underneath the stone exterior. He was very quiet. He was very insecure because he had a very poor education compared to many of the men around him. One indication of this that I find rather touching is that during the war he would rewrite his letters or have Alexander Hamilton, his aide, rewrite his letters to correct the spelling and punctuation in them because he was a lousy writer. He wasn't well educated. During a party when he was president, a friend of his bet another friend $500. Go up and slap George Washington on the back and ask him how he's doing. And $500 was quite a bit of money, so the guy took it, went up, slapped George Washington. How you doing, George? George Washington just turned around, looked the guy up and down with this iron cold stare, and the guy slunk off. He got the $500. He said, I will never do that again for any amount of money. Another party in Washington as president, and a friend of his, a lady friend, came up and was chatting with him and said, well, George Washington, I can see by your face that you're pretty happy tonight. And George Washington turned around on her and said, you are wrong, madam. My countenance has never yet betrayed my feelings. So this is a guy with a stone exterior. He seemed to be cold, very formal, very stiff. The other reason, besides the dentures and besides his own personality, is he was afraid of losing his temper. He had a flash temper. As a youth, he was known for being very hot-tempered. During the war, when his troops were not doing what he ordered them to do, he would curse, as one of his aides said, quote, until the leaves shook on the trees. Almost never violent, but he would curse and yell and scream at his troops. That's not the image we get of George Washington. When they're evacuating New York City in those little boats that all the fishermen brought right ahead of the British Army, George Washington is trying to organize the evacuation. And of course, all of the men are rushing for the boats to get off the island. And instead of lining up, and George Washington is cursing again at them and they're not listening. And he finally picks up a big boulder, good size 100-pound boulder. He's a big guy, and yells at the men, if you don't line up, I'm going to throw this and smash the boat and none of you will get out. They all lined up immediately. So on occasion, he had this violent temper, which is another reason he kind of close under wraps. He was afraid of losing his temper. We have seen him before in the Ohio Valley. Also during the war, he was very bold, very cool under fire. He would be risky, take chances. There were a number of times during the Revolution, and of course he always had a white horse because he was commander-in-chief. He would ride within 100 feet of the British lines. And there were times when Hamilton and some of his aides would grab the reins of the horse and lead him out of the battle so he wouldn't be shot, because the whole thing would fall apart if George Washington was killed. Thomas Jefferson said, this is a man who is incapable of fear. But this hides a sensitivity underneath. He was a little bit vain. He was a little bit insecure about his poor education. When he gave his farewell address to the troops and his farewell address as president, on both occasions there are tears running down his cheeks. He loved his troops. He loved his officers, his own stepchildren. He is the man who coined the term band of brothers, which is used commonly in the military. He never blamed others for military failures. He never criticized other commanders. He took the blame. I'm commander-in-chief. I'm the one responsible. We don't see that too much more. Religion, probably a deist, although he is the one who never openly said. You could call him a warm deist, maybe not a hot one. He was raised in the Anglican Church. His wife was a devout Anglican, Church of England, and he went to church with her. But he never took communion in the Anglican Church. He never kneeled in the Anglican Church. During his presidency and as commander-in-chief, he wrote to 22 different religious groups. He talked repeatedly in his letters and in his speeches about the will of God, but never mentioned a religion. He did believe absolutely in a God. There is a God, not sure about anything else. And he believed that God had chosen him. This was his responsibility to lead the revolution, and he never turned aside from it. Very pragmatic, practical, very much a realist, not an idealist like Thomas Jefferson. I'm quoting George Washington, "We must take human nature as we find it. The motives which dominate human affairs are self-love and self-interest." So you have to play on people's interests. They're not going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts, which he found out during the Revolution, trying to get money for his army. You can beg and plead all you want. They're not going to send money to you. So the war made him very much a practical realist. He adapted. He learned. There was no pattern to follow. He was pioneering everything. Another indication of his practicality, he argued after the war and as president for 8 years, we need a large standing army. We had just fought a war to get rid of British troops, so he's bucking the tide here. Congress was trying to limit the army to 3,000 men. At the end of the war, we only had less than 1,000. During his presidency, they did get up to 3,000, and George Washington argued repeatedly and very humorously said 3,000 men army would be sufficient if the U.S. were never attacked by an army of more than 3,000 enemies. So he knew exactly what he was talking about. George Washington and slavery is an interesting sidelight here. At one time or another, the first 18, almost all of the first, well, we had 18 presidents before the Civil War who owned slaves. The two Adamses did not. George Washington was born into Virginia Plantation Society. Remember, his father owned 48 slaves. George Washington at any one time always owns over 100. His family of 4 had 12 personal servants around the house for their needs. He never questioned slavery, never thought about it, never thought about the morality of it until the Revolution. And he was always known, even before the Revolution, as a quote-unquote, big quotes around this, good master. There is no good master, but no slave could be physically punished without George Washington's written permission, and he did not give it very often. There is no good master, but if you had to be a slave, George Washington was one of the better masters to be. During the Revolution, he changed his mind. The ideals of the Revolution were incompatible with slavery. You could not lead a revolution for freedom and own slaves. As he said, this disgraces our arms. He opposed having black soldiers until he saw freed African Americans from the northern colonies fighting voluntarily for the revolutionary cause, and then he changed his mind and let them fight for the revolution, and about 10% of the revolution was fought by African Americans. Very quietly and privately after the war, he begins to support abolition societies to end slavery. He also, very practically, on his farm, started to switch from tobacco to wheat, potatoes, peas, and other crops that did not require a lot of slave labor. So he was already thinking ahead. Of the 9 slaveholders, the 9 first presidents that we have who owned significant numbers of slaves, George Washington is the only one who freed his slaves. He freed them in his will after he died. He knew it was too controversial to free them while he was living. There's some other problems with this. First of all, he freed all of his slaves in his own will. Martha lived for another 5 years or so. Her slaves he could not free because he did not own them. They went to her children. And by that time, both sets of slaves had intermarried, and it was a very difficult problem. He did forbid selling any slaves in his will, and not only did he free them, he is the only one who provided economic support. So the slaves that were too old to work anymore, George Washington set aside money so they would be provided for until they died. The slaves that were too young to work, he set aside money so they could be supported until they were old enough to earn a living, or be educated to learn to read and write, which was illegal in many places. He did not operate schools on his plantation, but he had no opposition to them learning to read and write elsewhere. When he designed Mount Vernon, he hid the slave quarters far away from the main house. His own family opposed freeing their slaves. That was their wealth. At one time, there were 300 slaves at Mount Vernon, of which only 100 are actually productive. The others are too old, too young, or house servants. George Washington once said to his Secretary of State, if America ever splits into North and South, he saw the problems with slavery. I'm quoting, I had made up my mind to remove and be of the northern part. So he had decided if the colonies should split after the war into slave and non-slave colonies, I'm going to move into the northern free colonies. So his attitudes and actions on slavery are pretty mixed. He knew it was a serious problem. He didn't quite know what to do with it, and partially did not have power over freeing all his own slaves. He said at one time, the United States slavery will be punishment for our want of public and indeed private virtue. We will be punished for slavery. He knew. So, why is George Washington great? What is the greatness of George Washington? Abigail Adams, wife of his sworn enemy, it was also a Federalist. John Adams is a Federalist. If he was not really one of the best intentioned men in the world, he would be a very dangerous one. Why? He is unquestionably in charge of the military. This is a serious problem in a democracy. Whoever controls the military controls the country. First of all, why is he great? He's incredibly lucky. He inherited money. He goes through the French and Indian War. He goes through the American Revolution untouched with any bullet, untouched with any wound whatsoever. Ben Franklin's in Europe, John Adams in Europe, Thomas Jefferson was in Europe, a lot of the times doing diplomatic stuff as ambassadors. It is George Washington who holds the whole thing together. He had very high moral standards. He was 100% dedicated to the revolution. The minute war breaks out, he dedicates himself to the revolutionary cause. He is immediately drafted as commander-in-chief. He never questioned. He never gave up. He never broke under pressure. He never walked away from responsibility. If he had, there was a good chance the revolution would have disintegrated. But he is 100% rock solid. There is a great story when he is first appointed commander-in-chief and he shows up in Boston and he sees the men that are there, and there's a good number of farmers with their guns, and he wants to see the supply. So that he was told when he signed up for this that there were 200 barrels of gunpowder and the French were sending more. So he said, okay, let's see the supplies we have. So he was taken to the powder magazine, and there were 10 barrels of gunpowder, not 200. And he didn't say a word. He just turned white. He stopped a minute. He looked at the 10 little barrels of gunpowder, and he turned around and walked out. Many people would have said, that's it, I'm out of here. He did not. He did the best with what he had, which was not much most of the time. The main reason he is important, the main reason he is great, besides the fact that he never wavered, is that he turned down power not once, but 3 times. And turning down power in government is a pretty rare commodity, particularly lately. The first is the Newburgh Conspiracy. This is 1783. It's towards the end of the war. Remember, I had mentioned his officers and men had not been paid, sometimes for months at a time, sometimes for 6 months. They never got back pay most of the time. And his officers are on the verge of mutiny, basically. They had expenses and rations deducted from their pay. Remember, their families at home depend on this, so their farms are being foreclosed. They're losing their businesses. In the meantime, they're serving under George Washington with no pay. George Washington supported their grievances, wrote constantly to the Continental Congress, please send us salaries. But a bunch of his officers got together one night in a tavern and they started talking revolt. We can do a much better job. We can take over Congress. We can have a coup and appoint George Washington as king, basically. He can do a much better job than Congress is, and maybe we'll finally get our salaries. Somebody tipped off George Washington in the middle of the night. He rides over, he walks in. Remember, these are all his officers that he's been serving with, some of them for 5 and 6 years. And he gives a little speech for about 30 minutes and says, men, we cannot do this. This is a revolution for independence and democracy. You cannot have a military coup and establish a military government. That defeats everything we're working for. And he says, besides, Congress has pledged to pay your salaries. I have here a letter from them. And he pulls a paper out of his pocket and he looks down at the letter, and then he says, men, I have grown old in the service of my country, and now I am growing blind. And he has to pull out his glasses to read the letter. And at that point, a number of the men just burst into tears, and the whole revolt basically crumbles. They finally did get pensions, but only in 1818, and then only if they were pretty destitute. So Congress did not keep its promises to its own officers. So at Newburgh, George Washington single-handedly puts down a coup of the government. At Yorktown, when the British Army surrendered, Lord Cornwallis surrendered his sword to George Washington. And actually, Cornwallis sent a subordinate because he couldn't bear to surrender his sword, but he did send his sword. He turned it over to George Washington. Now, then again, George Washington is in control of the military, the largest military in America. He could, at that point, pretty much have taken over the country. His army would have followed him anywhere. There were no objections. Congress was not functioning very well at all. And George Washington, instead of doing that, turns around and surrenders his sword to Congress. What is he doing? Civilian power trumps military power. George Washington knows, number one, Americans distrust the military, and number two, civilians should be in control of the military. So our commander-in-chief is not a general, it is the president who is elected. This is not true everywhere in the world. The third time he turned down power was at the end of his second term. He wanted to leave public life. He was exhausted. He's an older man. His plantation was in ruins. 8 years of the war, he spent a grand total of 2 days at home. Even when he was nearby his plantation, he couldn't leave the army and just take a break. So at the end of the war, they write the Constitution. Who are you going to call as president? Everybody agrees George Washington. Didn't want to do it. They finally convince him, you have to do this. You are the one man everybody trusts. So he serves the first term. They come to him at the end of the first term and say, you have to serve a second term. The whole country will disintegrate. You're the only man people trust. And they talk him into it. The end of the second term, remember in the original Constitution, there's no number of terms given. You could serve 10 originally. And he says, no, I want to go back to my farm. And they offer him anything they want, anything. You have to serve again. The country will fall apart without you. They say, we will make you king for life. We will make you emperor. We will make you any title you want. You can be president without any term limits. You name it, you got it. King George of England, when he heard about it, said, if George Washington goes back to his farm, he will be the greatest man of his age. And he did, and he was. He turned down total power. He refused. He went back to his farm and died a few years later. During the war, he served with no salary, just expenses. 8 years, he never visited his farm. Oftentimes, no sleep at all. He had a cot in a tent, just like all the other men. And again, I am quoting Thomas Jefferson, the moderation and virtue of a single man has probably prevented this revolution from ending as most others have, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish. Happy for the country that the general of their forces can be safely entrusted with unlimited power. And George Washington could. That's what makes him great. He turns down power. That is extremely rare. Most democratic revolutions, most revolutions of any kind, promise they're going to set up democracies or republics, and they turn to dictatorships almost always within 5 or 6 years. Russia did, France did, almost every single one did. We did not, thanks to George Washington. He finally goes back to his farm after the third term. He rode around daily. He watched his fields. He directed, he experimented, big agricultural experimenter. He tried crop rotation, different manures, better animal feeds, and he dies a few years later after being bled 5 pints of blood. I will talk about George Washington as president a little bit in the next slide, but I wanted to talk about him as biography and his greatness. His grave, you can see the end of that slide, 73. He said, "Simple grave, I want to be buried on my farm." That big thing in Washington, D.C. was built 75 years after he died, and he would be appalled at it. His grave is there. It says